How will you know what love is if you've never loved a club? How will you know what pain is if a defender never hurt your tibia or you've never stood in a wall where the ball hit you right there? How will you know what endearment is if you never caressed the ball for a curve shot, hitting it with the outside of your foot so it floats right under the net? Listen to me. How will you know what solidarity is if you never confronted anyone after a cheap shot from behind to one of your teammates? How will you know what poetry is if you've never tried to get around someone with a fancy move? How will you know what humiliation is if they never scored more goals than you thought possible against your team that thought was going to win? How will you know what friendship is if you've never returned a wall pass? How will you know what panic is if they never surprised you unprepared with a counterattack? How will you know what dying inside a little is if you never went to get a ball from inside your own goal? Tell me, friend, how will you know what loneliness is if you never stood below the 3 posts 12 stops from a guy who wanted to execute you and end your hopes? How will you know what the pitch is if you never slid at the foot of anyone trying to kick the ball out to the sidelines? How will you know what being selfish is if you never took one more step with the ball when you had to give it to your teammate who was all alone? How will you know what music is if you never sang from the stands or sang a goal when you scored? How will you know what injustice is if you never got a bad call from a biased referee? Tell me, how will you know what insomnia is if you've never thought about why your team doesn't win all night? How will you know what hate is if you've never scored a goal against your rivals? How will you know what crying is? Yes, cry if you've never lost a game where you knew you could have done a lot more for your team. How will you know, my beloved friend, how will you know what life is if you've never played football?